Everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video, as you will have already seen from the thumbnail, is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, I have two for this one. For the outer, this gorgeous sort of minty fresh viscose. It has little navy diamonds on it, and to match that, for the cami underneath, a navy viscose. Both really flowy and perfect for a project like this. And on to the cutting out. So this is my little cami piece for underneath. My fabric is on the fold. I have one bust dart and I'm just indicating the position of the legs with little notches. Another little notch at the centre of the shoulder. Popping in a pin at the point of the dart and marking with my chalk pen just where that pin pierces the fabric. And now lining up my ruler with that chalk mark and those notches and drawing in my line. And ready to pin. So pinning the point of the dart first of all, making sure those notches at the bottom of the legs are joined up, and pinning through the chalk line on top, out through the chalk line underneath, and back up through again. So that's that done, and ready to stitch. Starting at the bottom of the dart legs, back stitching, following that chalk line the whole way up and pulling my threads to finish. And I'll just give that a press and tie off those threads off camera, which you can see I've done here. And now to stay the neckline. So I'm just running a tiny little stitch about 1 millimeter or 2 inside my seam allowance, from one shoulder the whole way round the neck up to the other shoulder. Back stitching to start and to finish, and that just needs a bit of a press, which I've done off camera. And now that that's done, I'm ready to finish the neckline, and I've chosen a bias finish here. So I've cut myself a strip of the navy fabric on the bias, and I'm just lining it up with the neckline at the shoulder and popping in a pin, and then to the machine to stitch at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Back stitching to start, making tiny little adjustments the whole way around, taking this nice and gently, and back stitching to finish. So that seam needs a little bit of a trim and a press. So I'm taking off probably about 2/3 of that seam allowance here, and then pressing the bias away from the bodice, but making sure that that trim seam allowance in underneath is butted up against the bias. And I'll finish that off camera, and this is how it looks. So now to understitch. So I'm placing my needle through the bias, through that trim seam allowance in underneath. I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the seam you've just seen me sew, using a little bit of a longer stitch length. And what this is going to do is to help that bias lie nice and flat in underneath. So that's that done. So now to take care of that raw edge. So folding that edge over the stitch line I've just sewn and pressing into place, giving myself a nice crease line, and then folding again at that crease line, making sure I can see that understitching, and pressing the whole way around. And that's what it looks like when it's all done and ready to stitch down. So I've placed my needle as close as I can get to that inner crease edge, back stitched, still using that same longer stitch length, trying to hug that crease edge the whole way around, and backstitching to finish. And once it's had a nice press, this is how it looks. And off camera, I'll repeat that whole process again for the arms, and this is the result. So that's my neckline and arms all finished nice and neat. So the last bit of prep work I have to do on this piece is to deal with the hem. So I've decided on a double folded hem. So to do that, I'm pressing that raw edge in underneath by about half of my hem allowance, folding again by the same amount and pressing. And ready to stitch. So just like the bias before, I've placed my needle as close as I can get to that inner crease edge, backstitched, still using that longer stitch length, trying to hug that edge the whole way across, and backstitching to finish. And once it's had a good press, this is how it looks. Nice and neat and tidy. So that's my little cami piece all prepped. I have my neckline and armholes bias bound. I've got my darts in and my hem complete. So this piece is ready to be joined to my outer at the shoulder. So on to the outer. This is my back. My fabric underneath is on the fold. A couple of notches at the waist and one at the underarm point. So that's my back all cut out. And off camera, I've popped in just a little bit of stabilising tape around the neck. So I want to add some gathers to the waist of this piece. So to make the gathers, I'm going to run 2 lines of stitching in between those notches you see me snip. So backstitching to start, using the longest stitch length on my machine, sewing within my seam allowance, and pulling my threads to finish. So that's the first line done. And for the second, I've just moved my needle to the right just slightly and sewing a line of stitches right alongside the first, backstitching to start and pulling my threads to finish. So that's that done. So now to create the gathers. So I'm just picking up the 2 threads from the top, leaving the 2 threads underneath as they are, holding on to those 2 top threads and pushing the fabric along. And once I'm happy that it's gathered enough, just tying the top and bottom threads together. That will just hold everything in place. So now this piece is ready to be joined to my peplum. My fabric underneath is on the fold, and I want to create gathers in this piece as well, so I have corresponding notches. So that's that all cut out, and off camera I've created those gathers in exactly the same way as I did previously. And here I'm just lining up the 2 waistlines, making sure I've gathered enough, and once I'm happy, tying off my threads. And then to help me out on the next step, I'm just pressing across the top of those gathers. That will just flatten everything down and make it much easier to sew. So that's my peplum all prepped and ready to be joined to my back at the waist. So laying it right sides together with my back, lining up my notches and pinning. And ready to stitch, backstitching to start, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, taking it nice and easy over those gathers, and backstitching to finish. And I'll finish that seam on the overlocker and give it a good press, which you can see I've done here. So super happy with this. So now to finish the neckline. And just like the cami before, I've chosen a bias finish. So I've cut myself a strip of the outer fabric on the bias, lined it up with the neckline at the shoulder, and just repeated all the same steps as I did before, and this is the result. So super happy with this, nice and neat and tidy. So that's my back all prepped and ready to be added to the front. So I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, a notch at the underarm and one at the centre of the shoulder, one at the centre of my tie, and a couple of very important little notches on the waist at the top of the tie. So that's my front all cut out. So the first thing I want to do here is to tackle the tie. So I'm folding it in half, lining up the 2 waist notches, making sure my edges are all matched up, pinning, and ready to stitch. So starting at those notches, back stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, the whole way down to the bottom of the tie, and back stitching. And I'll finish that edge off camera, give it a bit of a press, and this is the result. So now to close up the bottom of the tie. So lining up that center notch you seen me snip earlier with the seam I've just sewn, pinning and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So I just need to finish that edge, which I'll do off camera, and trim my corners. So I'm just snipping away that fabric on both of my corners. That will just help to give me a really nice finish along those points. Ready to pull through to the outside. And after a nice press, this is how it looks. So you can start to see the shape the front is going to have. So super happy with this. So to finish the neckline on this piece, I've decided on a facing. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath this pattern piece. And now just to add a tiny bit of structure here, I'm adding in some press-on lightweight interfacing. This will just support the neckline and help it lie nice and neat. So that's that done. And one final bit of prep work before I can add this to my front, and that's just to finish that raw edge. So I've ran that through the overlocker, and here just lining up that unfinished edge with my front and pinning into place. Ready to stitch. Starting at the bottom with a back stitch, taking it nice and gentle around that curve at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way up, and finishing with a back stitch. And I'll finish that edge off camera and give it a press. So you can see that here. And while I was there, I've also finished off my hem. So now I just need to press that facing away from the bodice, and like the bias before, make sure that that finished seam edge is butted up against the facing. So that's that done, and ready to understitch. So I've placed my needle through the facing, through that seam allowance in underneath. I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the seam you've just seen me sew, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. And that just needs a good press, which I've went ahead and done off camera, and this is how it looks. And while I was there, I've just pressed up my hem by my allowance, so I'm super happy with this. Nice and neat and tidy. So that's my front all prepped and ready for the cami. So laying right side of cami to wrong side of front, lining up those shoulder notches you seen me snip earlier, lining up the underarm notch with the underarm of the cami, and lining up my side seam, pinning, and ready to stitch. Starting at the shoulder, sewing within my seam allowance, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching to start and to finish. So that's that done, and onto the side seam. Same thing again here, sewing within my seam allowance, back stitching to start and to finish. So that's that done. So super happy with this. So now that my cami is attached to my front, I'm ready to close up the shoulder seams. So laying my back over my front, right sides together, lining up those shoulder seams and pinning. And to keep everything around the neck nice and neat and tidy, I want to catch that front facing in the shoulder. So just folding it back over that shoulder seam and pinning into place. You'll see how that looks in a second. And ready to stitch. So back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and back stitching to finish. And I'll just tidy up that raw edge and give it a bit of a press, which you can see here. And then this is the result of sewing that facing into the seam. Just gives a really nice and neat finish to the neckline. And then while I was at the overlocker, I've just finished the edges of my side seams and armholes. I've pressed the armholes in by their 1 centimeter hem allowance in preparation for stitching. So to the machine, back stitching to start, sewing directly through those overlock stitches, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, and back stitching to finish. I've given that a nice press, and this is how it looks. So happy with that. And now that that's done, I'm ready to close up my side seams. So laying my back over my front, right sides together, lining up my underarm notch, lining up my edges and pinning, and ready to stitch. So starting at the underarm point, back stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and finishing with a back stitch. So I'll press that seam open, and this is how it looks. And while I was there, I've also pressed up my hem on the back, ready to stitch. So starting at my front curve, back stitching, sewing through those overlock stitches, using that same longer stitch length, and back stitching to finish. So I'll give that a bit of a press, and with that, this little blouse is complete. So I have that hem all nicely in place, got those gorgeous curves around that front edge, my ties at the waist, that nice bit of shaping across the bust where the ties pull the fabric, got my facing all in, the whole way up that neckline, my cami in place underneath, my back neckline nicely bound, and then on the back, those gorgeous gathers at the waist on both the peplum and the bodice, and again that nicely finished hem at the bottom. And this is what it looks like on. So I am super happy with how this has turned out. The fit is so nice, really comfortable. This fabric feels so cool against the skin, nice and lightweight. I love the shaping that that tie provides. I love that the cami is attached underneath. And I've made this one quite casual, but I've made another version of this which is a little bit more dressed up and works equally as well. I think there are loads of possibilities with this one. As I say, playing with the fabric, playing with the contrast between the cami and the outer, playing with the ties, playing with the peplum. Too many possibilities.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!